I'm David Jones, and for the last 3 decades, I've been researching how humans cooperate to get work done. In my research, I noticed the recurring appearance at many different levels of scale, organisation, and complexity of patterns in the phases of our conversational interactions and in the artifacts we preferred to use in those phases. In the previous video, I presented those patterns as complex adaptive system phases using complexity theory. In this video, I moved to seeing those patterns in terms of systems theory. In this view, the CAS phases are more clearly seen as conversational ecosystems we move through in our making by speaking. Humans make by speaking. This series of presentations introduces the strange attractor that is common to all human making by speaking. This MBS attractor was discovered by David Jones during studies that commenced in 1990 and is now being researched and commercialised by Dylan Jones and David Jones. The discovery of the attractor that underlies our making by speaking didn't arise through studies of complexity theory or from computers and computation. It was a result of decades of being involved in and reflecting about knowledge development processes. A knowledge development pathway is a generic term I use to cover large-scale commercial, public enterprise, or social processes where we cooperate to get things done. I was looking at those knowledge development pathways for the patterns in the way we talk to get work done. The things we make are social and material expressions of the knowledge we make. I've studied how we create that knowledge in outcome-focused enterprises, new product introduction processes, research and development processes, product development processes, law writing, estate development, and so on, everywhere you look. As with the sprinkler illustration, a simple model will help get us started. The outcome-oriented conversations of a couple setting out to build their own home. They move through distinctive conversation phases. The early scoping conversations with a dream that roam widely and eventually settle on the things that matter most. The conversations with an architect, the person who can translate their block of land, their image of their rooms they will inhabit, and the materials they prefer into a single, well-resolved entity. And then the conversations of building, where time, somehow it always seems to be a race before Christmas, becomes a key player. If those habitats of conversation get confused, we end up with the frustration of partners falling in love with building materials that are unsuited to their block or locale, or with significant disruptions to the building schedule as walls get moved halfway through the build, and so forth. At the level of our productive human interactions, ecosystemic themes emerge in the ways we talk and in the artifacts we use or create to support our talk. If we look at enough of these cooperative endeavours, the coordinations in conversation that lead to a new house or a new estate, or to a cochlear implant, or just to a picnic, we begin to see a pattern. We start to notice that there are ecosystems of conversational features that cluster according to where we're up to in any given knowledge-making process. When we're scoping out a new situation, features such as the breakdown that made us attend are well described, for example, by Heidegger. When we're generating hypotheses for change, for how to satisfy our want, features of ideation are prominent. The abduction of C.S. Peirce or the bisociation of Arthur Koestler come to mind. And when we're executing or implementing the solution we have characterized, all the themes of classic logic, linear inference, and in-out binaries become prominent. When Urologists shift from researching and describing the southern oscillator strange attractor to becoming weather forecasters. They shift from complexity thinking to systems thinking. They recognise many other interactional phenomena, such as blocking highs and coastal lows. The map becomes their canvas, not the attractor. To further detail the ecosystem dynamics that develop from the MBS attractor, we've also moved to a systems view, and we use a systems model, the requisite conversations framework, as our canvas. We didn't want our systems view to convey old ideas about communication as linear and one way. But neither are purposeful conversations forever open. Conversations are not linear, but they do converge. This wedge-shaped icon conveys both those features of conversation. We are also clear that conversations are not just verbal, and that there can be non-human actors in our conversations. The model uses that wedge visual to preserve the concept of conversations as emergent and convergent, while representing the question-answering dynamics in a process view. Because at scale, we actually separate out these conversation systems. In the way attractors are formed, it is the constant presence of feedbacks that enable the attractor to exist. So we do not call attention to them as a separate feature. But when we move to a systems perspective, the acknowledgement of feed-arounds becomes critical. And a side benefit of this is that it introduces a fourth thematic colour that will be useful in seeing correlations with some other systems views. Extending our metaphor of socio-material conversational ecosystems, we refer to the three major phases as habitats: the scope, generate, and build habitats. The systems view allows us to distinguish three significant conversational terrains. The create terrain, made up of the three habitats we just noted. The perform terrain, where we run recurrent conversations and have no intention to create novelty. Think of the operations of an air traffic control tower. And the monitor terrain, which has its own conversational ecosystems that correlate with the create terrain: correct, learn, and evaluate. Think of the conversations of continuous improvement, organisational learning, and governance as examples at scale. In this present video series, we are only addressing the create terrain. We can also illustrate the occurrence of recursions on the framework, and indeed how some socialised patterns of behaviour show up as fractals. An example comes in the social activity of making something in the world, the literal sense of building. In manufacturing, we are familiar with pilot plants. This is an early build of our solution that we intend to be a commercial proof of concept. It is very firmly an answering activity. Prototypes arise when we use a fractal of that same build cognition in the generate habitat, but we do it so that we can deliberately learn by failure. In other words, the activity is still question answering. And probes are small experiments we perform in order to get a complex system to reveal itself. A probe is a fractal build in generate, in scope, setting that we make in order to safely discover what we're dealing with. It is a questioning. The systems version of the attractor allows us to see that there are distinctive interactional forms of conversation. But even more significantly, those patterns of interaction are called for when we perceive ourselves to be in specific kinds of problem spaces. That is, If our question arises in the upstream scope habitat, we will need to approach it differently than if it arose in a more downstream conversational ecosystem. These system forms and our interactions arise from how we experience the system in focus. How we talk about a situation shapes how we conceive of it and how we act in it. I suggest that we can also find some insights into the formation of culture by our making by speaking. If we adopt Margaret Archer's morphogenetic cycle and lay it over the system frame, we see structural conditioning arising from our immersion in previously generated cultural expressions of our making by speaking. Those resources are then used by human agents in their social interactions, and as they progress their question answering, the socio-material thickening drives further structural elaboration. In this, we find an integration and an abolition of the dualisms that have haunted questions of structure and function, agency and culture, and so on. To end this flying visit to a few systems theoretical implications of the requisite conversations, we'll return to the world of discourses. Algertus Greimas studied and wrote about narrativity, about the structure of stories around the world. He included work on folk tales by Prop, on the structure of myth, and on theatre. Greimas wished to find behind any manifestation of narrativity a fundamental semantics and grammar. Boiled down, this is the underlying grammar of narrative he found. Why establishes a want or a need. Y characterises the want sufficiently to enlist aid from X. X determines that there is a way their capabilities can address the assignment. X details the plan necessary to accomplish the objective. X executes the task, the outcome is observable, and the performance of the outcome satisfies the requirements. Seen through the lens of our systems view of the MBS Attractor, this is how Greimas' deep structure of all narrativity shows up. In an area of work of tremendous relevance to our era of knowledge work, work done by conversational technologies, Francois Couren has been writing about the organising properties of communication. How does our talking together create the organisations we work in? In progressing toward an answer for that question, Couren used Greimas narratology and combined it with speech act theory, and came up with a general schema for speech acts as they unfold in organising work. Again, the mapping onto the framework has an impressive correlation. Taking this line of research one step further, Speech Act Schematics examines the larger episodes or schematic forms that arise from stringing speech acts together. What happens if we actually use Couren's speech act categories to then analyse larger narratives? Here's an example from Fairhurst and Couren with our colour scheme laid over it. What's the pattern that we see? Scholars have used this method to study public council meetings, corporate board meetings, computerisation processes, parliamentary commissions, and other narratives. Finally, at least for this video, this speech act analysis also extends to the conversational ecosystems we have talked about. In a simple example of writing his own book, Couren breaks down his organisation tasks into the speech act phases we have seen: manipulation, competence, performance, and sanction. In his next move, Couren picks up on Latour's actor network theory that insists we attend to the other non-human actors in our conversational interactions. So Kuren's phases become places for ecosystems. In his competence phase is knowing how to do. He describes how he uses some helpers, i.e. instruments, such as a pen, a typewriter, a computer, and materials, sheets of paper, ink, etc. In the final video of this series, I'll come back to these matters of conversation analysis, speech acts, schematics, and so forth, and see them through the lens of being proofs for the making by speaking attractor. But for the moment, we've shown the usefulness of being able to take a systems view of the attractor dynamics and present them on a spatial and temporal framework, the requisite conversations framework. Elsewhere, I argue that this is the necessary and sufficient set of conversations for organising in human enterprises, and this has very substantial practical implications. For the human activity of cooperating toward outcomes, the act of making by speaking, there is a strange attractor. The dynamics of that attractor are illuminated by understanding them in terms of question answering. The attractor features are extensive, observable, and measurable.